Now, the G20 Extraordinary Committee of Independent Experts on Global Inequality is a high-level body established under the G20 Sherpa track during South Africa's G20 presidency in 2025. Its core purpose was to produce the G20's first ever in-depth report on global inequality, framing it as an inequality emergency that demands urgent, concerted global action. Let's unpack this further with UN independent expert on foreign debt and Professor of Fiscal Law at the University of Nairobi, Professor Attiya Waris. Professor Waris, a very good evening to you and welcome to Newzroom Afrika. Now, this is quite an in-depth report and unique in its kind.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a wonderful step forward and no surprise being led by a wonderful group of experts, including Winnie Banyanyima, and of course, African focused and very important, discussing this really big divide across the world in a multiple set of spaces, not just financial, but social, political, economic, of course, which is part of the reason I'm with you today.
Yeah, and I mean, the report by the committee tells us some startling data on the state of inequality across the globe. And in its introduction, it labels inequality as one of the most urgent concerns in the world today. What do you make of some of the findings that have come out of this report as well?
So the findings are extremely clear and they're very valuable and they're very important. And we need to take them very seriously because what we're seeing is inequality. I mean, we've just heard Keir Starmer talk about partnerships and not paternalistic behavior. And those are part of the conversations around inequality that we need to take very seriously. We need to ensure that these are partnerships, that there's equality in the space as much as possible at a political level. And we need to make sure that countries are being taken very seriously. We also need to make sure that just because a country is poorer or has less money, the economies are smaller, maybe they are more violent or have conflicts and wars, that doesn't mean that their voices are not given as much attention as the countries that are more peaceful and have more wealth. And so these findings are really important. It's a breaking ground report for the G20 and no surprise when they get the first African member chairing it.
Yeah, and I mean, just earlier today, we saw President Cyril Ramaphosa addressing world leaders, welcoming them as well, but also tonight hosting a dinner with African heads of state as well, because he's saying we want to put the African agenda at the forefront as well. We want to make sure that the African voice is heard. And we're talking about, you know, this great divide and inequality. Do you think that this move by South Africa to take advantage of hosting the presidency of the G20 will also be helpful, you know, bringing all the African heads of state together to say, almost kind of, Prof, like, let's share this presidency?
Yes, absolutely. And of course, the AU is very much part of it as well. And this is also a big step forward. You also hear the Secretary General talk about the fact that the African Union needs to have better representation in global spaces. So I hope that this dinner will allow the global leaders to speak with each other, hopefully in an informal setting, and build and deepen the relationship between them. We've had a lot of new presidents and young presidents on the continent. And so there is a wind of positivity. We have a very big youth population on the continent, and so it's important that the leaders take this very seriously. And inequality is, of course, not just between nations, but it's also within nations, and of course, between and within countries on the African continent. So I'm hoping this will be a great step forward, which will allow us to coalesce around synergies on the continental level.
Yeah, and you know, Professor Waris, you were saying that, you know, these findings, and as one can read in the report, are quite clear. And I want us to look at some of the stats that have come out of this report. And it also shows that nationally, 83% of countries have high income inequality. And those countries account for 90% of the world's population. Now, if we have stats like that that show that 83% of countries have high income inequality, and that's 90% of the world's population, and at the same time, it also shows that the richest 1% have seen their wealth increase. Clearly, this is unsustainable, but I want you to also paint what the dangers of such are.
So, I mean, you hear, for example, even in the conversations around green energy and new energy types and clean energy, you can hear a lot of conversations around the need to support investors, de-risk investors. I mean, this for me is a real problem. And this is probably the biggest cornerstone we're facing. Over the years, more and more countries have allowed the wealthy parts of their population to pay less and less tax. And so we have a scenario where high net worth individuals, that 10% that's, not in that bubble on the statistics you just talked about, that they earn a huge amount of revenue, but they don't pay a proportional amount of taxes. And so you have a situation of this deepening inequality because the wealthier are paying less tax proportionally than the poorer. And what has been happening in many of the developing countries is that instead of improving the income tax base, if I give you statistics out of my book that is called Financing Africa, it is 1% or 3% of Malawians over the age of 18 pay income tax, for example. Whereas in Kenya, my home country, it's about 35% of adults over 18 paying income tax. Then what you start to see is a push to collect taxes through what are called indirect taxes, which are not proportional. So VAT is based on how much you consume, but you and I will be consuming exact or very similar amounts and then paying similar amounts. But somebody's salary is different from somebody else's, and it's the salary difference where we have to set some really clear agendas. But the other thing that gives me a lot of concern is that Africa is one of the wealthiest continents in the world, for example. Yet, when you look at developing countries, you hear conversations around de-risking. We are not that risky to invest in. We are double-digit growth economies in many developing countries, including the African continent. Yet you see that the tone and the language in the international financial system is that we are higher risk. And so these are the particular challenges that I'm hoping they will address during the G20 conversations as well. And it has been alluded to in this inequality report.
And Prof, as well, when you're speaking about taxing the wealthy as well, there's always this notion whenever we're talking about taxing the wealthy, particularly in developing nations like African and states as well, that 1% will then, end up leaving and going to developed nations if you're going to be taxing them anymore, where they'll be able to see their service delivery, where they'll be able to see their value for their taxes. And then it kind of puts governments in a very precarious position to say, do we tax them? Is there this great fear that this 1% will end up leaving? How do then governments then straddle that?
So there are different strategies one can use. So some countries will try and do an income tax, but I think a more important tax is a tax on savings. But I also think there needs to be a message sent across to the wealthy in the world, because we are in one of the worst economic crises the world has faced in a very, very long time. And the result of that is people hold on to their cash. They don't invest. They don't spend. And so what's going to be really important is, while it is great to start to encourage them to pay taxes more and more and very much take part in the societies in which they live in, it's also important to make sure that we collect the part of it that is stuck or stagnant and that it starts to roll into the economies utilized. So these are things that are critical we need to look at. But when it comes to the conversation about businesses moving or shutting down or people changing countries, I mean, we live in a world where people have multiple nationalities, multiple residencies. And so these conversations are going to happen no matter what. But we have to encourage people to be nationalistic and patriotic. And there is a wonderful organization out there called the Patriotic Millionaires, for example, who take these things very seriously. But I think there's also the element of what is the dream that a person should have when it comes to financial stability, and what do we consider enough or satisfactory. And I think that these conversations need to be had at national level very, very seriously with populations. We all belong in the same world. We're all breathing the same air. The climate is changing globally. We've also got all of these problems around infrastructure. You can hear about electricity. You hear that from the EU as well. I mean, 40% of the African continent has electricity and 60% does not. These are staggering statistics. And the people who are wealthy are also good business people. The bigger your market, the more you can sell as well. So we're in it together, and I think there's a lot of good arguments to keep them in with us.
Yeah, and speaking about these staggering statistics as well, and the findings, some of the more concerning findings from this report, and that it found that there's been a weakening of the middle income groups in many parts of the world. Now, the middle class seem to be on the rise. What has hampered that growth?
I think that every country is very different, so it's hard to give you like a one straight shot. But I will tell you that the international financial architecture we sit in right now is not fit for purpose. We have a problem where the wealthier nations and the wealthier people have a lot better access. So we have, for example, we have a system of what are called tax havens or secrecy jurisdictions, and you can park your money in these places and spend a small amount of money and then register there. And then you can bypass a lot of tax treaties. It's called treaty shopping. We do a lot of round tripping. You can, push transactions through multiple countries and bring them back. And the thing is the world is allowing this. We need the G20 to take leadership on this. We need to make sure that there is a conversation around, if you're extracting finances from people, you have to take it fairly. And so we do have a growing middle class in some parts of the world, but I will tell you that there's a large drop of middle class going down into the lower classes as well. And there's huge unemployment. And now with the restructuring of massive sized institutions, the shutting down of some, you have USAID, you also have the UN restructuring. I mean, a week doesn't go by without me hearing about 100+ staff being released from one or another big organization. And a lot of these staff were considered to be high income or in the upper category. And so these are all now starting to drop. And so we need to have clear understanding of the position we've put the world in. And then we have to make sure that whatever responsibilities we give people, that we compensate them fairly for it. And we have to make sure that capital circulates constantly. And I think I say this a lot because I think part of the problem is not so much also just the extraction of taxes and the payment of debt, for example, but it's also to make sure that money is circulating in the economy. And if I can just add on, one of the things that gives me the greatest concern right now is that the world is going through more conflicts than we've ever had before. And I think that if we have one big takeaway right now, it's we have to make a decision to end global wars and conflicts as much as humanly possible.
Couldn't think of a better way to end off this discussion. Prof, thank you so much for your time and sharing your insights with us. We really do appreciate it.